Tisztelt Hölgyeim és Uraim, ladies and gentlemen. Először köszönöm szépen a kedves meghívást. Nagyon örülök, hogy itt lehetek ma délután. And now I'll shift to the language in which I am more comfortable. But first of all, thank you very much for your welcome. Today I'd like to explore with you the rational and irrational in the context of migration and diversity. A topic which has been hot not just for the last 3 years, but been hot for decades, and indeed hundreds of years. And I've got news for you, it's going to continue to be a hot topic for the next few decades and probably a lot longer. And the irrational and the rational clash on migration and diversity in a way which happens with very few other serious issues. So why is that? Because fearing outsiders is one of our oldest built-in psychological tendencies. And this is an issue which impacts on millions of people every year. It's had a major political effect on this continent since 2015 and the large influx of migrants into Europe then. It clearly had a psychological impact here in Hungary on Hungarians and on this country. And it's had a political impact in the Brexit referendum, in the US presidential election, and in the recent German and Italian elections. The Financial Times chief foreign correspondent, Gideon Rachman, recently wrote that immigration now rivals economics as the driving force in Western politics. And many people have said in recent weeks it's going to be a key issue in next year's European parliamentary elections. Yet it's clear that this is an issue where there is as much that is irrational as there is that is rational. So where do we start? Time for a bit of audience participation. Hands up if you're a migrant. Okay, good to see some of us here. So I'm going to start on my journey as a migrant aged 6 years old. I was born in central Scotland. I could say that if I'm in Hungary, I could say Skót vagyok, but when I say that, I know there are two meanings in Hungarian. Yes. One of them is correct, the other one's totally wrong. My father ran a biscuit factory in Glasgow. Some of you may have seen the biscuit chocolate digestives, McVitie's, that was his biscuit. And in 1965, at the age of 6, he was appointed to the headquarters of the company in London, and we moved from an industrial town in Scotland to the leafy suburbs of London. It was a huge shock, and it had a profound effect on me. Now, some of you may say, I'm not really a migrant, that I just moved within the United Kingdom. But there are huge differences between Scotland and England, political, economic, social, cultural. And those differences were far greater in the 1960s than they are now. My difference was I had a very strong Scottish accent. In fact, my accent was so strong that my parents put me into elocution lessons to weaken my Scottish accent. It was the subject of jokes, and children make jokes and make lots of them. Now then, I did not think in terms of rational and irrational, but I couldn't understand why my accent made me a victim, if you like, in the playground purely because of my Scottishness. As a consequence, and as a reaction to that, I became consciously even more Scottish. I became a young, patriotic Scot expat. Holidays to Scotland compounded this effect. Now, in the same way you go to a petrol station to fill up your car with petrol, I would go with my family to Scotland at Easter, in the summer, maybe Christmas, and I would fill up with things Scottish. Scottish food, Scottish drink. I hasten to add, at the age of 6, I wasn't drinking whiskey. Scottish football, everything Scottish. And as a consequence, I really became something, if you like, of a Scottish nationalist. Now, looking back, I think we can draw a rational, irrational lesson. Rationally, I should have integrated, and to some extent I did. I was good at a game called cricket, which is as foreign to most Hungarians in this audience as it was to Scots in the 1960s. But irrationally, I took on this sort of nationalistic attitude in a way, a sort of a form of resentment. I clung on to various aspects of my Scottish identity. For example, my nickname at school was Jock. Now, Jock is a stereotypical and sometimes derogatory term that the English use for Scottish people. I loved being called Jock. I relished that. So I can understand when some migrants hold on to their original identity rather than integrating. And frankly, many of them have a lot stronger reasons than I had. Mine, if you like, was an adolescent reaction. I was not the victim of full-on, full-blooded racism. And yet here, in 21st century civilized Europe, millions of people are the victims of racism every day. So it is maybe not unnatural that many migrants reject the societies into which they have arrived. They reject those values. If they're not made to feel welcome because of the color of their skin, over which they have no control, or because of the religion that they've been born into, why should they be positive? But how then do we describe the reaction of people to migrants who they see as different? Are their fears rational or irrational? We move on to 1974. ABBA are number one with their hit Waterloo. I'm 15 years old when my father retires, and I have a choice. Stay in England and go to boarding school, or go home with my parents to Scotland. I hated the prospect of boarding school. I came from a large family, we were a close family. And I was Scottish, with the prospect of going home to Scotland. No brainer. I moved, but again, I found myself to be a migrant. I was at school in Edinburgh, and I was the English boy. This is rather ironic. For those of you who know Edinburgh, Edinburgh is probably the most English city in the United Kingdom outside of England. English middle-class habits, accents which could be slightly English. But I was very much the outsider. I had come up from London. Now again, you could say that I was just migrating within a country, that these are childhood experiences where the irrational play an undue influence. But let's just think about that. Babies are not born racist. Nelson Mandela said that no one is born hating another person because of the color of his or her skin, his or her background, or his or her religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than the opposite. Children are not naturally anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim. By the age of 6 to 8, kids have learnt to mirror parents' attitudes, the attitudes of those around them, their prejudices, their rational and irrational fears. Let's fast forward to 1980. ABBA's hit now is I Have a Dream. And my dream had come true. I had dropped my Scottish nationalism. I had adopted, if you like, British nationalism, and I was about to make my third migration internally within the UK. I was moving to London because I joined the Foreign Office as a young diplomat. I was used to moving. That was a good news because in the 38 years since, I and my wife have moved 8 different countries. They are, if I can remember, Poland, Qatar, Japan twice, Australia, Romania, Hong Kong, Bahrain, and Hungary. So when people talk about migration, about different cultures, about diversity, I speak from experience. In virtually every place that I have lived and worked, migration, diversity, and associated rational and irrational fears have been an issue in one form or another. Japan. Like the United Kingdom, an offshore island off a continental landmass. Unlike the UK, a country which traditionally had been inward-looking with a strong suspicion of foreigners. In the 1990s, one of the big issues in Japan, a country with a rapidly aging population, a low birth rate even then, was the influx of Japanese Brazilians or Brazilian Japanese who had come to Japan to do jobs that Japanese people wouldn't do, largely hard jobs, dirty jobs, dangerous jobs. The Japanese government believed that Brazilians would be easily integrated because of their Japanese background. The opposite was true because they were treated as foreigners, they were discriminated against. Even children born in Japan were discriminated against. They looked Japanese, but they did not act Japanese. They also had a Brazilian identity. And this apparent contradiction between being a nationality and seeming a nationality causes conflicts of adaptation, of acceptance in many societies. Another good example would be ethnic Germans from Russia who have found it difficult to integrate in Germany. For me, the Japanese example is a clear one of the rational and the irrational. It was rational for the Japanese government to encourage Brazilians to come to their country, given the aging population, and given that Japanese people were unwilling to do many of the tasks which Brazilians would do. If there was an irrational fear, or if there was a rational fear, it was that these people would undercut wages. That's an issue in the United Kingdom too, where in many of the low-wage industries, there's been concern that the large influx of workers from Central and Eastern Europe has brought down wages in low-wage industries. But in Japan, it wasn't the rational fear that won over. It was the irrational fear. That was the more significant one. These people didn't speak proper Japanese. Their families, their parents, their grandparents had emigrated from Japan because of largely economic reasons. There was a stigma associated to these grandkids because of what their grandparents had done in leaving Japan. There was also concern that they would bring social problems from Brazil. By contrast, Australia, where immigration was a constant theme, this was a country that was built on migration. The debate there was largely rational. As a country, Australia has always needed migrants to grow. It has probably got one of the world's best managed migration programs. And my experience of Australia, of a multicultural Australia, was very positive, as indeed was my experience of Canada and the US when I went there during school, student summer holidays, as is my experience of my own country, the UK, which brings me to diversity and the rational and irrational perspective there. My own experience of traveling around the world for the last 40 years or so is that diversity is fundamentally and rationally a good thing. It brings creativity and innovation. It brings growth as societies benefit from diversity. Diversity of thought, diversity of background. I have certainly felt enriched by that experience. It has opened up my mind in a way that I could never have imagined back in 1980. I think I'm more respectful of other cultures and of other norms. A practical benefit, I think it's enabled me to build rapport with people from hugely divergent societies, from Australia to Bahrain, from Japan to Hungary. But I can understand that some people feel that diversity threatens their way of life, their culture, their language. I can particularly understand if people feel that they are disenfranchised in the process of deciding how their society is going to develop. But to suggest that diversity is in itself fundamentally and basically wrong is, I think, an irrational fear, the fear of the other. And coming from the UK, I find that hard to understand. The UK, 4 nationalities, English, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. Diverse, but united. As island nations, we have had to travel the world, travel the seas. I'm just reading a book that my son gave me for Christmas about how the British Empire was basically built on food, with fishermen from England traveling to Greenland and to the great fishing grounds off the east coast of Canada in the 16th century. Our connections around the world go back hundreds of years. Yes, colonies, yes, an empire, as a result of which we now have a Commonwealth of 53 nations who met in London in April, representing 2.4 billion people, the so-called Anglosphere. As a result of that history, we have a multicultural UK, which I'm hugely proud of. I'm proud of the fact that London, the largest city in Europe, 8 million people, our capital city, 3 million of the 8 million were born overseas. They have brought with them over 300 different languages. So the diversity of thought, the diversity of background has made London one of the most diverse, economically exciting cities in the world. And a message for you is, I do not believe that Brexit is going to change that. The B word is now out there. The elephant in the room has appeared, and I'm going to talk about Brexit in a migration context, the migration factor. Now, some of the concerns expressed about migration during the referendum campaign were rational, were real, others were not. The rational fears were that with freedom of movement of labour, there was no control over the number of people coming to our, by any standards, small island, and in parts overcrowded. The influx of people, and particularly since 2004, has had a huge impact in some parts of the UK, particularly in the east of England, which had not previously seen migration on the scale that we have seen since 2004. Public services put under huge pressure. Education, schools, hospitals, general practitioners. In a way, we were unprepared. You could say you only have yourselves to blame. This particularly affected rural areas and towns in the east of England. There were real fears. But there was also an element of the irrational fear of foreigners, people speaking odd languages. But here, there are ironies which reflect the rational-irrational dilemma. Boston, not Massachusetts, Boston, Lincolnshire, from where the Pilgrim Fathers set sail to Massachusetts in the 17th century. Boston in Lincolnshire was in the referendum the most pro-Brexit town. 75% of people there voted to leave the European Union. I don't believe it's a coincidence that Boston has seen the largest increase in EU migration of any town in the UK. In 2001, 1.5% of the population of Boston were non-British. Now, nearly 20% of the population, under 20 years, under 2 decades, nearly 20% come from the European Union, particularly from this region, many from Poland, Lithuania. Now, talking about Poland, I mentioned at the start, that was my first posting. I come from this town in central Scotland, which traditionally has had a strong Polish community. I love Poland, I love Poles. And let's think about it. Poles, European and Christian. In largely white British communities, perfect migrants, you would think. Yet it's clear that many people in places like Boston and elsewhere in the east of England felt very unhappy at the way that their communities had changed without, as they saw it, any say from them, any input from them as to how this would happen. And again, reading articles, looking at newspaper stories, people talking about foreigners speaking their own languages, having their own shops. There are misconceptions about foreigners taking jobs. But with unemployment so low in the UK, under 5%, if there are no EU workers, who picks the crops? A current issue of concern to farmers. Who cares for the sick in the hospitals and the elderly in the care homes? An issue of concern at the moment to the National Health Service. These are just 2 examples, but there are many more. It was economically rational to bring in workers where we needed them. They contribute wealth to their community. They contribute diversity of thought, of fresh ideas. They keep communities going. So the local MP for Boston has pointed out that thanks to the influx of migrants from Central and Eastern Europe, now that 40% of all births in Boston are of children to migrants, the maternity unit in the local hospital is now viable. The Catholic Church in England has had a revival due to the influx of people from this region. So what do I conclude from all this? There are rational fears about migration, diversity, and multiculturalism. There are also irrational fears. History and common sense tell us that irrational fears are dangerous. If we ignore rational fears, if we do not allay people's concerns, if we do not address their concerns with rational argument, people turn to the irrational. But why does this matter? Because migration is going to continue to be an issue for us in this continent. And why is that? Why does migration still matter here? Because our demographics are changing. Low birth rates across the continent, people living longer. By 2030, over a quarter of the population of this continent will be over the age of 65. Some examples. In Hungary, according to the UN, is due to be 5% smaller in terms of population by the year 2030. There are already labour shortages here. When Philip Hammond, the British Chancellor, was here last September, he said that he thought the biggest challenge for Europe in the 2020s would be competition for labour. Ageing populations are a threat to economies and societies because of the increasing costs of pensions and of healthcare, but a smaller working population, smaller amounts of money coming in from taxpayers, putting government finances, public finances under pressure, leading to debt. And that issue is compounded by population movement within Europe. In my view, it is highly unlikely in a Europe of freedom of movement of labour, with higher wages in the West, and with a consequent movement of people, particularly young people, from east to west, I think it's highly unlikely that population growth alone can solve long-term demographic problems and challenges, which is why the British government, my government, supports managed migration, safe, orderly, and regular migration, which is why EU citizens matter to us, which is why I'm happy that one of the first things that we did agree upon in the Brexit negotiations was on the rights of European Union citizens in the UK and British citizens in the European Union. People do not need to leave when we leave the European Union. People matter to us. Migration matters to us. We'll continue to need migrants. But to conclude, the debate about migration and diversity has to be a rational debate, because frankly, if it's an irrational debate, we are all lost. Thank you.